What applies to drums can apply to any other sound we can produce on this machine. A guitar, for example, sounds totally different when played really quietly, really loudly, and everywhere in between, simply because the strings vibrate in different ways depending on the violence with which they're plucked or hammered. A saxophone will react differently because of the way it's blown. If you blow it really hard, you'll get that really raw sound, or you can get a really gentle, reedy type of sound that comes from it when it's played very gently. And the force with which we hit a key on a real piano can be quite subtle, or it can be really violent, and you can generate really subtle differences in the sound from just... So it's not just changing the volume, it's changing the tone. And when we strike a key, the force that is applied to it in synth terms is referred to as velocity. That's velocity, how hard we hit the key. And a velocity sensitive keyboard is a keyboard which is sensitive to velocity, i.e. it's sensitive. It changes as we hit the keys more violently. And a number can be given to velocity between 1 and 127. The most gentle being 1 and the most violent being 127. Now that's up to about 50. So you've got that scale, and what we can do is we can set up to 4 different samples from say 1 to 25, another one from 25 to 50, another one from 50 to 100, and another from 100 to 127. So different samples are being triggered depending on how hard we hit the keys, and that's all the multi-sample is doing. We need to know that 127 is an important number in relation to synthesizers, and that's why velocity isn't set to scales between 1 and 100, for example, or it could be, but we'll discuss 127 in detail later, because it's a mathematical idea that comes from the good old days of binary and the early days of MIDI, which we're going to talk around in some detail later. But for this particular part of the discussion, all we're looking at is the scale of velocity, which is between 1 and 127. So each time we strike a note, depending on how hard we hit that note, a particular sample will sound. If we have different samples to choose from, we can have a much more realistic sound and imitate some really complex instruments. And that doesn't just have to be drums, keyboards or stuff like that. It can be some right weird stuff, which would be synthesizer sounds rather than strings or drums. Now the cross lets you use up to 4 samples, hence the term multi-samples, and there's no reason why you can't set them up so that you've actually got different sounds playing, different samples playing, so that you can start with a very gentle sound that's producing a piano, and above a certain value it could become a harpsichord. You could even have the sounds sounding together. I'm going to show you how this will work. I'm not going to go into detail as to how it's done, because that's part of the programming that we'll talk about later, but it will give you an indication of how the samples can be used with different velocities.